Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited you are here. I am Regina Boyd. I am a wife and a mom and a mental health counselor, a therapist. I do a lot of work with couples, with people experiencing stress and anxiety and trauma, and just looking forward to being here with you today. And we also have...
My name is Sister Josephine Garrett. I'm a sister of the Holy Family of Nazareth. And the way I live that charism is serving as a licensed counselor. But my two favorite areas to serve in as a counselor are the specialties of children and adolescents and the healing of trauma. And I'm also really grateful that y'all thought it a good idea to take the time and talk about mental health in the middle of the day on a Thursday. Uh, so I'm grateful. I'm not sure if we need to continue to wait for folks to join. So I do want to check in with our support folks from the NBCC offices and just to make sure if we need to wait a little longer or if we should continue to press ahead. There may be something in the chat. Just a second.
Sister Josephine, feel
Yes.
free to go ahead and go on. That's fine.
Okay. Okay. Um, so I don't know if there's anything you want to share by way of introduction more, Regina, about ourselves, or to share. I'll get our presentation pulled up and you can share kind of what we promised to cover for the day.
Sure, yeah, we're going to talk about, as the title says, leveraging mental health to share our stories. In a particular way, we're going to get into an approach called narrative therapy, and we're going to learn about how valuable our stories are to overcoming our mental health. So paying attention to all the factors that impact that, whether that's what we say to ourselves internally, whether it's external factors of our environment. All of these things can play a role. So we want you to learn about story, the role of story in your healing process, and give you some tangible skills and tools that you can utilize today to walk away with implementing this in your own life.
So we're going to start with in the field of mental health, there are several approaches that are considered evidence-based, research-based, and so official theories of counseling. And we thought that one of them provided a rich foundation and just a rich framework on understanding story and its role in healing. Regina's going to talk more about that narrative therapy. But to anchor that conversation on our conversation on story, I love this quote from Brene Brown. She says, "I now see how owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing that we will ever do." So Regina is going to share about the background of narrative therapy, and the importance of not only owning our story, knowing it, owning it, and then entering into it, to be a participant in the ways that Christ wants to redeem it.
Thank you, sister. Yeah, so first I want you to imagine that you're going to meet a friend at the park, and this is a close friend. This is someone that you regularly meet with. You have your regular spot in the park that you go to. It's a beautiful spring day, so you bundle up a little bit for that winterish wind and whatnot. You go downstairs, you take a little walk down the street, and you're just hearing all the sights and sounds of your neighborhood as you go to meet this friend. There's children playing, there's birds flying in the air. You see the trees are starting to bloom. And you're starting to round to your normal spot in the park. And you see that path and that curve. And just in the distance, you see your friend waiting for you in your normal spot. And just at that moment, suddenly you realize that something's very different. Now, I think we're natural storytellers. And if I were to ask anyone just now, you were probably filling in all the gaps of that story as I was describing it with your own images, your own details about what the neighborhood looked like, what the park looked like, what the children were playing as you noticed them when you walked by. And so we have this ability to tell stories and fill in gaps. And that's a little bit of what we mean when we talk about narrative therapy. And I want to tell you another story about a young woman that I worked with. She experienced a difficult childhood. She had parents who were very distant to her. They sort of had this emotional abandonment. They weren't emotionally available to her, but she learned over time that she could receive love and affection and praise from her performance. So whenever she earned good grades, when she excelled at work, this was a way for her to get attention from her parents. Otherwise, she was very isolated in her experience. She was isolated at school as well, bullied sometimes, teased, but not when others needed assistance with their schoolwork. And so it's really where she learned that she could receive attention not only from her parents, but her classmates. And it's how she felt like she belonged. And she began to internalize this sense of worthiness, that she was only considered worthy or worth spending time with if she knew how to excel in something, if she knew how to give of her academic ability. And that impacted her well into her adulthood. Her dating life, she made a lot of poor choices in who she dated because she was very desperate for attention from another person. And so when we talk about narrative therapy, we have these two men, one from Australia and the other from New Zealand, who's founded this concept. And they have this thought around that we live our story throughout life. We sort of select these significant or central events that build around our story. And it's kind of how we see ourselves. So we tend to pick memories and instances from our life. And we have this process of selection that shapes how we see ourselves, our lives, our past, and even perceive our future. And so in narrative therapy, the goal is to bring greater balance and truth to the stories that we are telling ourselves and reduce what they call as problem-saturated stories. These problem-saturated stories can lead to identity rooted in problem. And we know that we're created in the image and likeness of God, that we have dignity. And so we know that people are not the problem is the problem. And so it's important to begin here because the story we tell ourselves really drives the perception of the present moment, and it's often unconscious. So if the stories that we tell ourselves are problem saturated, then we can see our lives as tragic. And if we see our lives as tragic, then we can fail to live the reality that Jesus Christ has overcome and has the ability to give us new life. And so, with that young woman that I was telling you about, as we worked together, we had to talk about certain parts of her story. We had to look at what she was making central in her story, such as her worth and value in academics. And we used all kinds of strategies, exposure stories to talk, exposure response is a method where you can talk about past memories that are hurtful to help somebody find healing in that. But it was part of a way to help her have a more truthful story that she was telling herself. So we would recall those memories, and that would help bring about those series of problems for saturated thoughts. We eventually invited Jesus into this narrative. And once Jesus became a part of her story, there was straightening of crooked lines. He showed the truth of who she was, a beloved daughter, regardless of her work status, a beloved friend, regardless of her relationship status, and she began to recognize how shame was playing a role in her life. So once we were able to recognize it, it made it much easier for her. Once we pulled those elements out of her story, it was easier for her to reject those lies that she was internalizing and allowing God to be the true author of her story. Do you want to take it, sister? I think you're muted.
What stands out to me as I'm listening to you about narrative therapy, just like something I want to share also, is narrative therapy is not about changing the reality itself. Like things that hurt or just things that are hurtful are just hurtful. The events that are bad are just bad.
Yeah.
And our experience of them as bad is not on us, and not um and not our experience of bad is not only due to our view of it. There are things that are objectively bad. And so I saw here in our notes, Regina and I are looking at our notes from last summer. Like we didn't retype this up for y'all today. And so I'm looking here at my notes, and I didn't even remember sharing the story of when I was trained in a type of therapy called EMDR. And it's a type of therapy that helps to reprocess memories and unlearn unhelpful learning from the past, and learn new learning that will be helpful. And when I was in training, when you were training, you got to be the patient, you got to be the client. And so, but we bring kind of simple memories to the training. And I had a memory of being bullied in middle school. And that bullying was actually connected to my race. And whenever I would think about that memory, it was a lot of pain would come up. And when I reprocessed it, it didn't change the bullying. It was like my view of that day expanded. So that bad event was still there in the day, and the sadness about it was still there. But what expanded and also had governance about my perception of myself and my life, remembering who I went home to, and that I was able to talk to someone about that, and that, I was received and my emotions were received. And so I think it's really important to point out that the problem saturated aspects of our stories don't mean that our view of those bad experiences as bad as our fault. And so I want to I want to say that I think it's so important in mental health, especially as Catholic clinicians, that we make every effort to root what we're talking about, our work, our effort, in the gospel, in the scriptures, and in the teachings of the church, which we can do because the psychological sciences are good. We know there's not a competition between the sciences and the faith, but they work along well together. And so when Regina and I were reflecting on this idea of story, and like leveraging our stories for healing and entering into our stories in a deeper way, we thought of the Gospel of John, chapter 5, and the man who is asked, "Do you want to be well?" And so I'm just going to read that to you briefly. It's the Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Hebrew called Bethsatha, which has 5 porticos. And in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew that he had been lying there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is troubled, and while I am going, another steps down before me." And I find it really interesting how the man who needed healing responded to Jesus. I was having a conversation with, I've had this conversation with multiple clients where, and this type of conversation comes from the discipline of EMDR therapy, where it's, are you ready to let go of the problem saturated view of your experience? Because sometimes it can be comforting to hold on to it so long. And so it's like, are you ready to let go of it? Because it's also fearful sometimes to receive the unknown, even when that unknown is healing. Because I know how to live with this problem and I know how to live with the pains that it brings me, but I have not yet learned what that healing might be like and what that might look like and what other problems might present in that. And so I find it really interesting that in this man's case, he says, he really responds to Jesus instead of with a yes, he responds with an account of his problem saturated story. I have no one to pick me up. These are my problems. And like the solution and the healing is right there before him. And so I think all of us are asked, do we want to be well? But it presents us, as soon as we're asked that question, our whole story is brought into the present moment. How I perceive myself, how I perceive my past, how I view my future, the risk that comes along with healing, the risk of the unknown, the risk of viewing myself in a different way and viewing my life in a different way. And so I really think a lot of us can relate with the man in John chapter 5. And I think that's why Brene Brown said what she said, the courage of owning our stories. I also wanted to share that as we enter into this, I think it's really important in the discipline of narrative therapy. It was founded by guys who I don't think were super Christian. And so there can be this like tinge or hint in it of like a sense of self construct, like I construct myself. But we know as Catholics, as Christians, that the one story is objective truth. And so I have here in the notes that the downfall of the secular narrative therapy is that it is divorced from objective truth, and this cannot be us. And so we can receive from the tradition. But I love this quote from Cardinal Seurat that explains this better than I can explain it because he's a whole cardinal. So he should be explaining things better than I could. He says, man is fundamentally an heir, and he receives a history, a culture, a language, a name, a family. And to refuse to be inscribed within a network of dependence, heritage, and filiation condemns us. And so, what that's saying is, as we seek to understand our stories in a more profound way, face them, as Jesus asks us the question, do you want to be well? And our whole story is brought before us. Well, gosh, what's not well in me? And where did that come from? And how did I get here? And where am I now? And what do I long for in the future? Like, as Regina is saying, like, as all those questions come up, all of that comes to my mind. Do you want to be well? Brings the whole story to the present moment for us to know that as we work to reduce a sense of problem saturation in our stories, that we are walking into and on the ground of salvation history, the one story. And so we're talking about narrative therapy. We're talking about its root in really salvation history and our one story and what Jesus desires to do in us. But we want to equip you with practical tools for that. Regina, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add before we go into that. Because at the end of the day, if like Christ became flesh, then our rubber needs to hit the road. Yeah, the rubber needs to meet the road. And so I don't know, Regina, before we go into practical tools, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so, sister. I think you just described it so beautifully. So I
Mhm.
appreciate that.
The first tool, thank you, Regina. The first tool that we would like to share with you, it's one that, and I want to stop now and pause and just do some housekeeping. These QR codes that you see and that bit.ly code that is https:// and so forth, NBCC Mental Health 23, that takes you to a Google Drive that has this presentation in it, as well as the handouts we're going to reference. And so the first one is something called a therapeutic family tree. And I'm going to try to share that with y'all now. And this is something that or an alternative family tree. You could call it therapeutic or alternative. I'll pull it up and share it with y'all now. And as I'm pulling it up, I want to tell you that the first time I encountered this, I was on the receiving end of this family tree. And so I was in a workshop on family systems, but it was not for training to be a counselor. It was actually a part of my formation in religious life. And so the folks who were responsible for my formation, they really wanted us as future consecrated women to have a good handle on our lives and our experiences, because we knew and we understood that if I want to offer myself to Jesus in the vows, then I have to have myself in my hands to offer. And so gathering of the self up into my own hands is a process of self-knowledge. And so I was a novice. I was sitting in a novice workshop on family systems. And the clinician who was leading that workshop, she asked us to do a family tree. But she gave us these instructions. She said, write your family tree to the best of your ability on a piece of paper. Include yourself, your siblings, your parents' siblings, aunts, uncles, paternal and maternal grandparents, and any other detail you choose. Strive for at least three generations, but if you can do more, great. And then after that, she asked us, once all the members were on the map, to look at a list of experiences. And these are kind of experiences that kind of are social, emotional, sociocultural, socioeconomic experiences: addiction, abuse history, domestic violence, separation, divorce, anxiety, depression, suicide, autism, personality disorders, codependent behaviors, which will line up sometimes with addiction and drug use, workaholism, legal issues, any other categories you can think of, attachment styles. And so we started to put all this on the map and really started to see the patterns. And there was something very empowering for that. It wasn't a moment of like despair, like, oh my gosh, I'm trapped in this unending pattern that I have no governance over. It was actually very empowering to see it in front of me, because then I had this knowledge about my story. And that knowledge was very empowering. And so I love to encourage people who are wanting to enter in a profound way into their story, to consider doing this activity. I think the best case scenario is to do this activity in the care of a counselor or perhaps with your spiritual director, but to not do it alone. So I'm going to go back to our presentation, and Regina has more to share about practical tools.
Yes, and I think too, when you're doing that family tree and picking up on the patterns, there's so many things you can add to that as well, like families members' work history. I mean, there's just so many things we can learn about ourselves that really build us up into who we are and how we view ourselves. So what was the next activities?
Before I play this video, I would love if we could introduce the idea of epigenetics as a
Okay.
tool for understanding our story.
Okay, yeah. So we've kind of covered why our stories matter, and we want to add something here to show you why it's even more important. And it's this concept of epigenetics. So we're going to play this video, and then we'll circle back and talk more about what epigenetics is, why it's important, how it plays a role in our stories.
Mhm. This is a video that I sometimes will show to parents in general. I use it most often when children are presenting to therapy for trauma healing to help parents understand the role of loving relationships. So.
A child's experiences early in life are important building blocks for the developing brain. Genes, nature, are like the blueprint. They provide the basic framework for brain development. However, genes do not design the brain completely. Environmental influences, nurture, fine-tune how the brain works by shaping which brain connections get used. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent, whereas ones that do not get much use fade away. Together, genes and the environment build the foundation for all future development. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships early in life lead to healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well. Stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk-taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, how do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well. The good news is that positive, supportive relationships at any stage in life can make a difference. However, supporting families and children early on design the brain completely. Environmental.
I want to pause there, and I just like, before I pass to Regina to share more about epigenetics, I want to just really highlight that last thing the narrator said, like the good news. Like, I think sometimes folks talk about epigenetics like it's a curse, but epigenetics is actually good news because it says that like our relational choices have the ability to not only impact us, but impact the future beyond us. And so, Regina, I don't know what more would you like to share more about epigenetics?
Sure. Yeah. I think, we don't have a full understanding of it. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done in this area, but we do know there's great promise for healing and change, especially when we can change those things in our environment. Like Sister mentioned, our relationships, the people around us, how we're taking care of ourselves, and anything that's in our environment changes the way those genes are expressed. And we would like to add that the environment includes your internal thoughts as well, right? We're thinking about the environment of your mind and those stories that you're telling yourself. So as the video mentioned, our DNA is influenced by stress and trauma. So the trauma in our stories can impact us, and it actually alters our DNA, changes how we manage stress and how we respond to it. If you'll let me geek out a little bit, there's a couple studies I came across. One was with Holocaust survivors. So they actually studied women who were pregnant at the time of the Holocaust, and they lived in one of the cities that were cut off from food supplies. So they were pregnant, obviously very stressed. They weren't getting a lot of food, and they followed the children that were born from those women after the Holocaust were over. And there were a lot of health concerns that came up for those children. They had higher rates of obesity, higher rates of schizophrenia, and other types of mental health concerns, which I find very fascinating because they were inside their mother's womb and theoretically weren't as knowledgeable about that stress. And yet somehow there was something passed on in those experiences. There's another study with worms, and they followed worms, and apparently there's different types of dirt that is poisonous to worms or whatnot. And so there was the first generation of worms were eating this particular soil. They came across a poisonous soil, and as they were dying and passing away, they laid eggs. So that was their last act before they died. Those eggs, those worms that hatched from those eggs, knew to avoid the poisonous soil. And that lasted up to 3 generations after that first set of worms who passed away. And so what again, I think to bring that hope in this situation, it sounds like, oh no, are we cursed because something happened in our family a long time ago? But the way we look at this is that you might think that you're at a certain point in your life that you are the way you are and there's nothing you can do to change that, but that really couldn't be any further from the truth, that you have no idea what you're capable of. When you put yourself in the right environment, in the right situation, and tell yourself that environment of the mind, telling yourself that right story. So who knows what is lying dormant within you that is just waiting, those right triggers, those right situations to trigger those resilient genes. We want your resilience triggered. We want leadership, creativity. We've heard of those situations where people go through renaissance periods in their life or their elderly years. And we believe that the same can happen for you. So these changes that happen aren't necessarily permanent, but they're certainly adaptive and helpful. They were very helpful to those worms. Depending on the situation, they can be very useful. But when we take time to be intentional, like you are today, when we take intentional action, then with our relationships, with our work environment, with the messages we're telling ourselves, now all of a sudden our DNA is being influenced by those positive things.
Yeah, I remember once I was visiting Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, and really like visiting there to pray and like almost like take a retreat and reflect on the life of the people who were there enslaved, and also like pray in reparation as I walked. And I was standing in one of the little cabins that would have held a family at night, and thinking about, we can think like from an epigenetic perspective, the trauma passed on. But I think I would dare say clinically, there's a higher prevalence of resilience among Black Americans who are descendants of enslaved people, um, more so than other populations. And I think that can be attributed to epigenetics, like the faith and the joy in the Black experience, the sense of community, the sense of family in the Black experience. And so I just think it's so important for us when we think about epigenetics to know that good has been passed on to us, that we are stewards of and can then pass on to others. Um, we wanted to also, so one tool is the alternative family tree. Another tool is understanding the impact, um, that all those things Regina listed, to healthy living and healthy relating, the impact that has not only on you personally, but to rewire that software, right? Those worms software was rewired to interact in a different way with the hardware of their DNA. And so to know that like that you have that power. But we also want to talk about shame versus guilt, because I do think like in the Black experience in America, we have to be really vigilant and mindful, because there's a lot of subtle ways that the Black community can be discouraged from moving away from a problem saturated story and allowing our stories to expand in the areas where they've been prevented from expanding, and like allowing our understanding of ourselves to continue to develop in truth versus in historical lies. And so there's a lot of shame that has been packed on to our communal narrative that doesn't belong to us and is not our property, and that we need to put away. And so I want us to understand shame versus guilt, so that we can I just saw a really good question and I will answer it. I want to talk about shame versus guilt, because when we define it, we're more readily able to combat it. Because shame can be quiet, it can be subtle, and it likes to live in the dark. It cannot thrive in the light. When this spoken out loud, it loses its power. And so, shame versus guilt. I'm going to use my friend Brene Brown again. She says, I believe that there is a profound difference between shame and guilt. I believe that guilt is adaptive and helpful. Like I did something wrong. I need to be accountable for it. It's holding something we've done or failed to do up against our values and feeling psychological discomfort. I live in religious life. I apologize all the time, for different things that I've done that don't match my values. She goes on to say, I define shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do, we've decided it makes us unworthy of connection. And so I think um, I really want to see good shame work for us individually, but also for us communally, because as Black Americans, we are still discovering how to have governance and authority over our narrative as it's told in this country. And that is also, in my opinion, a process of eradicating shame from our narrative that doesn't belong to us, but belongs to those who put it into our narrative when they told our stories for us. Regina, would you like to add anything before I move on to the next
I
aspect of
think,
shame?
yeah, I think that shame is very contemptuous, right? When we're trying to tell the difference, it's almost involuntary, eats away at our hearts and our identity. So I think the big difference is it's just spewing negativity. It tears down our character. It makes us believe these untruths. Whereas guilt, guilt might say something like, I wish I hadn't made that mistake. Where shame talks about, how could I have been so dumb? What is wrong with me? So it's a direct attack on who you are. So we want to pay attention to, again, what we're telling ourselves or what's being told to us, because that can increase all of those side effects. Anxiety, depression negatively impacts our mental health when we're not paying attention and letting that be something that's chronic. So we want to give you the ability to increase that self-awareness of that negative self-talk, those messages that are internally happening, especially in regards to shame and guilt.
And then I'm going to speed up a little bit because I want us to have a full 15 minutes for any questions. And then if we find we aren't using all that time, we can kind of come back and expand on things more and show you some more of our handouts. There's a model from a book by Marcus Warner. I think it's called Understanding the Anatomy of the Wounded Heart, something like that, but it's by Marcus Warner. And he has this model called Wolves that I'll use a lot with my clients. It helps to provide a framework in a religious framework for EMDR therapy, but I really use it even beyond that to help my clients understand what's at work when we're dealing with their wounds. And so wolves stands for wounds, lies, vows, and strongholds. And what Marcus Warner says is that all of us are going to have wounds. It's not about not having wounds. It's about what happens after that space is opened up. And so he has this kind of like parable, like modern parable, where he says, when a wound is opened up in the human heart, or in the human experience, two sowers of seeds stand on either side of the wound. One sower is the enemy, and one sower is God the Father. And God the Father wants to sow seeds of truth and love and goodness and his glory in that wound, right? To allow it to heal up from deep inside out. Like St. Augustine says, in my deepest wound, I saw your glory, and it astounded me. And then the enemy wants to sow seeds of lies and shame and isolation, right? Wants to sow seeds that help to cause us to remove ourselves from communion and community, and allows us to see ourselves as the sum of the wound, versus seeing the wound as simply something that happened to us. And so, what Marcus Warner says is, when the enemy is able to sow seeds, they are seeds of lies. Those lies then will lead to vows. So, if the lie is true that I am bad and I am the sum of this wound, then I make a vow that no one will ever see that part of me. And so, like Regina's client, so I become a people pleaser and I become a performer, so that at all cost, I vow that no one will see the lies in this wound that I think are true. And then from that becomes strongholds where we build walls around ourselves as a result of living out that vow, and build walls around the wound as a result of living out that vow. I just think it's really interesting. And so my clients sometimes will say, when they hear the fruits of the seeds of the sower, who is the enemy, they now pray over themselves. Like they fill their minds with thoughts of prayer, to rebuke those lies, and to like fill their minds with thoughts of the sower, who is God the Father. really quickly, I'm not going to go to the handout, but there's also a handout on understanding the physiology of shame. It was important to me to include that for y'all because shame is something that is difficult to cognate about. I don't know if that's a word, but it's something that's difficult to go top down, intellect down into the body because shame has a texture, has a physiological experience. And so it's sometimes easier to grab a hold of what's going on shame wise by beginning in the body and then submitting what you know notice in your body up to your intellect to be explored and evaluated. And sometimes that can help us to break through the lies that come with shame and shed light on them. So I encourage you to look at that handout. It asks different questions that help us get in touch with the physiology of shame. And then again, knowing what's going on in our minds, Regina touched on that, and I know she wants to touch on it some more.
Yeah, I think paying attention to our internal monologue, and we have a worksheet that goes along with that as well to help you think through that. But paying attention to how we speak to ourselves, and how do we speak to ourselves, and particularly when we make a mistake. So are we saying, I wish I hadn't done that? Or are we saying, how could I be so dumb? What's wrong with me? And therefore recognizing when the enemy uses shame to delay our healing. So shame creates these storylines that make us believe we're unworthy of love, like Sister said, especially God's love. Shame speaks untruth, the language of the enemy, and it really can blind us from who we're created to be as kings and queens reigning eternal with the Father. So are we speaking in ways that affirm and honor our dignity or tear down any road? So part of this worksheet is a way to start recognizing those thoughts, catch you in the act, catch you in real time. And part of that is taking a step back and thinking about something that might have happened in the past or in your recent past. So think about it. You can start by thinking about a situation where you've noticed some negative thoughts that came up for you. Maybe you were irritated in traffic, irritated with somebody at work. So describe the situation first and then write down and list any negative thoughts that might have arisen for you. The second step is to reflect on those thoughts that you had about the situation. Oh, I can't believe he or she said that. How could she do this to me? But we want to pay attention to the underlying emotions. What are possible feelings of shame that are connected with that negative experience? So maybe there's some core beliefs there, like Sister was mentioning with the lies from the wolves model. Do you have a fear of abandonment, that I'll be alone forever, that things will never get better, that I'm afraid, I'm powerless, no one will ever love me or want to be with me? We don't realize how attached these thoughts can be to our negativity. So that's a really important step to slow down to. And then the third part, which is where things get really fun and interesting, is to reframe, is what we would call it, or create an alternative thought. What's an alternative way that I can be thinking about this? So you take that negative thought and that shameful thought that you have, and we're going to reword it in a different way. So for example, I'm frustrated with my boss. I'm feeling inadequate as a worker. Maybe I'm going to get fired or something like that, reprimanded. But a reframe thought would say, today was a tough day, but I'm going to make these adjustments for tomorrow. But that doesn't actually say anything about who I am or what quality of worker that I am. So we want to take the time to rewrite those alternative thoughts, even if we don't believe them, even if we don't want to accept them right away, but to give ourselves the opportunity to start telling ourselves the truth about who we really are, who we're created to be. So that's a way you can take time and utilize that for yourself as well. And then,
Thank you.
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Do you want me to go back to the share of it?
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
And then that last section is just about reflecting on what the positive impact would be if you embrace those positive thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
Thank you.
Mhm.
I get this presentation pulled back up. And again, I just want to remind y'all at the link at the QR code, each handout we've talked about is there in the drive accessible for you. We don't mind if you share it. We just want, yeah, we don't, that doesn't bother us. And we've got we've got our information on the bottom, so it's okay if it circulates and is shared. So I just want to recap the tools. We talked about understanding our family tree and understanding like how the story has been infleshed and concretized through. We talked about the role of epigenetics and that really being about passing on the good that has been passed on to us and then reworking and reframing that which needs to be reworked and reframed and how empowering that is. We talked about addressing shame, knowing what its voice sounds like, and also managing our thoughts. Um, and also that shame has a physiology. Sorry. I'm just going to read what we have here in the closing. It says, "You deserve great mental health care." I want to repeat that. You deserve great mental health care. You don't deserve the healing side hustle on the internet in the Catholic Church. You deserve great mental health care. You deserve licensed professionals who thought enough of you to discipline themselves in the field of mental health. Okay. You deserve that. You deserve for that to run alongside your pastoral care, nothing less. And the Black community deserves integrated and whole story. And we should be encouraged to not let stigma keep us away from that. What we do for ourselves as individuals is a gift to our community. I love the song that was playing instrumentally in the waiting room before we got started. It's the song, "I Need You to Survive." I pray for you, you pray for me. I need you to survive. That Kirk Franklin song. Is just really perfect for where we're ending, which is this quote from Pope Benedict the 16th from his encyclical on hope. And he says that we should recall that no man is an island, entire of itself. Our lives are involved with one another through innumerable interactions. They are linked together. No one lives alone. No one sins alone. No one is saved alone. The lives of others continually spill over into mine and what I think, say, and do and achieve. And conversely, my life spills over into that of others for better or for worse. And I think that that's really good news. It means that what we do for ourselves is a gift to us as individuals, but also to our community. We have a couple questions, Regina. Is there more you'd like to say before we take these questions?
I'll just add off your therapy preaching, I'll say, that therapy is not for crazy people.
Yes,
It
it's a
is
gift.
for healthy people, right? It's for healthy people that want to thrive, that they want to help others grow. And so that's really what we do when we unpack our stories. We can find those areas that we need healing, or we can experience gratitude for what we have received and can extend that hope and healing to other people. But yes, we would love to have your questions. So let's
Okay, I'm
see.
seeing them, which is cool. I've got two windows up. One is like actual from the Q&A and then coming from the chat from Valerie and Kimberly. So this first
Okay.
one says, "Sister Josephine, you mentioned that there are risks that come from healing. Please explain. Thank you." When we have to do our informed consent as counselors, we learn that it says like there are risks to this healing, like your life might change. But your whole family didn't come to therapy with you. So like if I change and then I go back into a family system that is unchanged, that healing can actually sometimes bring about distress in our relationships. And so it's the process of healing. I think about it, if we liken it to the process of healing physically, it's not always comfortable. And I think that realization that the process of healing is uncomfortable, um, that is what presents the risk. And I think can sometimes make us hesitate to go on the journey of healing. Like we know that the end will be good, but we can fear the process and the bumps and struggles and pains and adjustments that come along with that. Regina, would you like to add more?
Yeah, I'll just agree. So yeah, it's a little bit of a Pandora's box sometimes. That's what I usually tell people, that when once we open that box, we don't know what's going to come out, how it's going to come out, but we promise we'll patch it all back up and
We're
put
gonna
it
pack
back.
it all back up. Yeah.
Right.
We're
It'll
gonna
get
put it all back.
reorganized.
I hear that all the time with EMDR. People are like, I don't want to do it because I don't know I don't know what's gonna come up. And I'm like, your body's not gonna betray you, and your mind's not gonna betray you. And so if it's coming up, it means that your mind and your body, your heart and your soul and your mind are ready. Otherwise, it wouldn't come up.
Right.
Um, this next one is, does guilt somehow urge us to correct our misdeeds? Yes. I think
I think
guilt,
so.
yeah, I don't think guilt's a bad thing. I think shame's a bad thing. I think guilt is appropriate and is a gift because I think it can spur us on to virtue. This next one says, so shame can be passed on to future generations. I think that's a good question. I would really refer back to the video and say the effects of shame again. So, like how our software interacts with our hardware. The hardware is the DNA, the software is how the exchange of communication goes. And that we know from the research so far that we have is likely passed on. So, shame can contribute to toxic stress. Toxic stress evolves how our epigenetics play out. And so, in that sense, what we're learning from a science perspective is that, yes, in that sense, I could say shame is passed on. So, it's not the shame itself, it's the toxic stress that can come from living with that, and then how that evolves, how our operating system, our DNA interacts with itself. I really love that worms analogy, because it really, really perfectly explains that relationship between software and hardware. What would you say, Regina? The question is, so shame can be passed on to future generations.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and I'll add that we don't know how that's going to be passed on. So when you mention the hardware versus software, our genes will express that differently depending on each person. So for someone, that stressor of shame could look like anxiety, or for someone else, it could look like somebody who's irritable a lot more often, or it could look like somebody who is generally a positive person, that people pleaser, whatever it is. And so all that to say is I think a big part of that too has to do with the environment and the combination of the genes. So if your family's telling stories of shame, that can exacerbate things more than a family who tells stories about resilience and growth and change as well.
Thank you. I have here, it looks like a comment, a sharing. As she writes, I had this experience when I began healing from my family trauma. I moved on so that I could heal from the trauma. Would you have some suggestions on how I can have a relationship with my sister and family now? I just want to accept them where they are, and I want to be accepted where I am at this point. So she's saying she experienced that stressor intentions as she sought healing, and the system that she was abiding in didn't go along on that journey with her. Regina loves relationships. She got a whole book about relationships, so I'm going to let her answer that question.
I just think it's so beautiful, her desire, your desire for reconciliation, for healing. What a great example of forgiveness that we're called to. So I'll put in the caveat that as long as this means that you're safe interacting with your family, and that can mean mentally and emotionally as well, but assuming that you can tolerate a bit of stress of interacting with them again, right? You hopefully are working with someone to plan for that and prepare for those interactions. I think being really clear and transparent is huge. Stating your intentions to reinitiate the relationship, what you desire, and seeing what their response is, giving them the opportunity to reciprocate that or possibly not, and be open about what your boundaries or needs are, of how much space you would need, what you want to see. Beautiful. Okay, so I see you're working on that. Some baby steps, you said, moving forward. Great. Yeah, so that's perfect. Being really clear about your intentions I think is going to be the best way forward as you guys rebuild, because there's so many memories that could need to be spoken about and some that might not need to be spoken about, but really taking it from today of how do we want to move forward? What do we want our relationship to look like now? I think can be a great place to start.
She says, however, they're not very open with me. And I like to tell people, I think sometimes we think that reconciliation equals closeness, and that's not always the case.
Right.
Like I can be reconciled and have less closeness.
Mhm.
And so I think sometimes we need to kind of know that this can be reconciled to what it is in truth, and that look like less closeness.
Right.
Let's see, Regina, what is the name of your relationship book? What? You could have timed it better.
There it is, y'all. Leaving
There it
loneliness
is.
behind.
And so I'm going to leave that QR code up for a second, but also this presentation is in the drive that we gave you the link to. Judith says awesome. and it's got that code. Use code Boyd20 for 20% off. And it's a 2-book set. So you get a book and a workbook so you can work on your relationships.
And we got more exercises for you. We just want to put
more
all of
exercises, more worksheets.
And there's
then,
a whole section on betrayal and whatnot. But go ahead.
And then there's my book. It's just my story of faith on hope. You use the code HOPE25 for 25% off. And I do have a podcast. It's called Hope Stories. The entire first series was on the gift of Blackness in the church. So 17 really beautiful guests, one of which was Regina, came and participated in that podcast. And we're preparing for season 2, which I haven't told people this, but I will tell y'all. It'll be between us. Season 2 is on mental health. And I just was able to gather together really 12 really courageous souls who share their diagnostic experience and finding hope in living with their diagnoses. So we've got guests who are living with and managing bipolar, depression, anxiety, PTSD, surviving after suicide. This is a really, really beautiful season. Borderline personality disorder. Really, really courageous guest. And so that'll be out in June, but the whole first season on Black Catholics is available now wherever you get your podcasts. All right, let me see what else we have in the chat. Where can one listen to your podcast? Wherever you get your favorite podcast. So on your Apple Podcast, Spotify, the website is Hope Stories. I'll put the website in the chat. Let me see if I can get it. The website to listen to the podcast is hopestories.osvpodcast.com. And I will put that in the chat.
I've listened to every episode. It's very good. You don't want to miss it. You can skip over mine, but listen to the other.
Oh, I think that only went to the host and panelists. Let me see if I can. I'm not sure how to get it to y'all, but maybe let me see if I'll just change this and say everyone. There we go. All right. And let me scroll up here, Regina, and see if we missed any other. Are the links to your books available on the link that is NBCC Mental Health 23? Yes, because this PowerPoint presentation is available there. And so if you go to the bit.ly link we provided you, open up this presentation, you'll see those last couple of slides where we share our books and those codes. And let's see what else we have here. I think we've got all of these questions answered. Can I close us in prayer, Regina?
Please.
It says thank you very much. You're awesome. Y'all are awesome too. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the gift of our communities, the gift of our relationships, the gift of these minds and hearts in us that are formed according to your will and in your own image. We just ask that you bless us, bless our healing, give us courage and any other virtues, strength, and graces that we need to walk into and onto the paths that you are calling us to, the paths of healing that you are calling us to. Give us the courage to enter into the relationships, the loving relationships that you are calling us to. I also ask your special blessing on this Black Catholic community. May we with joy um, share the gift of Blackness in the Catholic Church with joy, with unrelenting perseverance, and with the assurance of the coming of your kingdom. We offer these prayers in the name of your Son and through the power of the Holy Spirit and through the intercession of our faithful Mother Mary. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you. God bless.